King's been out, came out in August. So, as one does, one sort of, the years start churning. And I'm about somewhere between a third and a half of the way through the third one, which I think will be the last.
Do you have a working title for it?
I've been calling it The Magician's Land, which is a name that I went through a period of loving and then a period of not liking. We're getting back. We broke up, and now we're getting back together again. The problem is, I'm a little bit vain about my titles. I've never changed the title after I arrived at it. And I generally arrive at it very early on, and it becomes this like bag of holding out of which I start pulling the rest of the novel. Somehow, weirdly, it kind of contains the whole novel, but compressed inside it. So I got very I flashed on the Magicians, and then I started to. Then doubt-sitting. But in fact, when I was writing The Magician King, I had this idea that I would. I was liking the stuff about Julia so much, and I thought, no, maybe I'll change it to The Magician Queen instead. And then I saw all the advertising that had been put into the paperback of The Magicians for The Magician King. I thought that ship has sailed.
I have a group of friends who, while they're at work on things, they sometimes have pretty ridiculous working titles, or they will see a series come out. There's a Divergent, Emergent, and then they were saying, well, the third one should be Detergent. You go for a law firm sort of magician. Something like that.
No, I really have to drive it into the ground. If there's going to be no more books, it's going to be just scorched earth. Yeah, the last magician, we're done. How do you do titles? What part of the process do they arrive at?
Sometimes pretty early on. I'm actually having a rocky time because I'm maybe a story and a half away from a new collection, and for the first time I really can't come up with a title at all for that collection. I have a working title which I like. I think it suits thematically. I don't love it. It's I will try it out. It's Get in Trouble.
I like it. Get in Trouble. I think that's great. The imperative mood.
Yeah, I do like an imperative title.
Is one
Go
of
out and steal things.
Is one of the stories called Get in Trouble?
Not yet. But, as they do stories, people get in trouble.
Yeah. I don't really write short stories, and as a result, I like to pretend that writing short stories must be incredibly easy. And I just assumed that whatever story came first in the anthology, you just use the title and then you go out to drink.
So, but you did when you started out. You wrote a bunch of short stories, right? Tried out short stories?
I think one of the things that delayed my my sort of development as a writer as long as it did, and it was delayed very long, aside from my sort of fundamental rapidness, was the fact that there's this idea when you're teaching writing that people start on short stories, and that is where you begin, and that is where you learn your craft, and then when you're sort of comfortable with that, then you move on to novels. I'm a terrible short story writer. I'm just awful. I've written, I kid you not, and I'm lowballing here, I've written 100 short stories in my life, of which 2 have been published, both of which after the Magicians came out, and both rejected chapters from the Magicians. For some reason, the grammar of short stories, I don't even seem to have any grammar. They're so compressed. It's like they're these neutron stars with structured molecules that start to break down. I don't understand what goes on inside them.
The one thing I sort of sat down and tried to write a novel. That was a disaster. It's sort of big, messy, really unattractive thing. And then I had a really hard time getting back to short stories. I just was as if I, pulled a muscle or something, and I couldn't quite get that back.
The first time I wrote a chapter of a novel, I just felt this incredible unburdening, like oh God, I've been trying to, I've been trying to sort of reveal all these human beings and what they're like, and sort of plan things, and then have them pay off in 6,000 words. It was just impossible for me. I couldn't do it. Plus, a novel, short stories have to be so perfect. And novels, it's like, if there's 10, 15,000 words where you're just in the weeds, it's all right. You just sort of steer through it, and you get back to the track. No one remembers that at all. But short stories, they seem so sort of like lapidary.
If I read a collection of short stories or a short story, a lot of the times I'm reading, I'm like, this is okay. This works okay, but I'm not smitten with it. Whereas novels, and I know people say all the time that novel gives you lots of room for screwing up. You can sort of waste some time here. That they're not perfect, but the novels that I really love, they seem perfect to me. I don't necessarily read a novel in narrative order. I will bump around in it. But
you're kidding.
No.
You jump around within the novel.
I do, because it's so long. because for me, part of the pleasure is finding out what happens over here, and then going back to the beginning and watching the author set it up. But having said that, most of the time when I think is, wow, they did that really well. It's not like I'm like, oh, the book is really good, but chapter 4 should have been cut. Whereas short stories, I'll read a couple of sentences, I'll be like, this paragraph would be so much better if they pulled that out.
Yeah. See, that's when I try to write story. I imagine someone reading it like that. And every sentence I something, could that come out? Should it be somewhere else? Somehow I seize up. Whereas with a novel, I just find it incredibly relaxing. You just vomit out all these words. You don't need to explain. I
have high expectations.
You go back and fix later. So how do you know when you've got a full collection? And you have a group of stories that makes up a book.
There's word count.
There's a macro in Word that just tells you, alert,
I think you're probably not going to get away with like 40,000, 50,000 words, unless they're like a couple of, maybe 3 novellas. You could do that with 2 novellas, but part of it is also, are there enough stories which have different kinds of moods or textures or just different feels to them, and are there stories in there that are funny, and what are the stories that feel like did you take any risks?
Don't you want them to be all the same? So
no.
They'll have a sense of community?
No, I want there to be I want there to be enough contrast, because otherwise I think with short story collections, you do have that feeling where you think, well, that was a great story, you read the second story, and you think, well, that's also a good story, but it's a lot like the first story. So I'm always really happy with a collection like Joe Hill's collection, 20th Century Ghost.
Yeah.
It's really very exciting. Although having said that, I don't know how much variety there is. Grace Paley story, and I could read her all day long.
As a novelist, I'm always trying to build a brand, so I extrude identical novels one after the other, and minor differences between them. Because that's this weird way. They don't want you to be eclectic at all. They want you they want you to deliver a similar thing, which builds on the last thing.
When I'm talking to new writers and we're sort of talking about what editors want to see or what kind of work I think they can sell, I say, well, what they really want is a book exactly like the last thing that they published that did really well, but which is different.
Yeah.
Needs to be the same but different. So.
But of course, you play that role as an editor and publisher as well as a writer. But do you think about that stuff, or are you sort of?
We think about it some, but it's not so much that we think, this is a great book, but if we publish it, we're going to lose money on it. What we think is, this is a great book, but I don't necessarily, and somebody will publish it, but I don't want to read it 9 times as I'm working on it and doing the cover for it. And that's how you know that even if a book is really good, sometimes you're not the right editor for it. It's because you don't love it enough to spend 2 years with it.
Yeah. What's the next book that you have coming out?
We have a novel by a writer named Sophia Sanator called The Stranger in Alondria, which is starts out like an epic fantasy, a pretty traditional book, and ends up becoming something much more like a Jane Austen novel, almost. It is a book about the experience of loving books as much as it is a traditional coming-of-age epic fantasy.
Right. We were talking about writing groups before. Do you still go to a writing group?
I do. We actually have some overlap.
Between your writing group
Yes.
and my writing group?
Yes. In fact, the way that...
Is there a mole from your writing group and my writing group?
No, but the way that it was reported to be that you were in a writing group was my friend who was in the writing group, Holly Black, and she said, Ellen and Billy have been cheating on us. And I said, oh, but whom? And she said, Lev Grossman and Kat Valente and Cora Goss. So I was like, oh, okay.
I'm sorry you had to find out that way. It's a very new experience for me getting sort of real-time feedback because I didn't go to an MFA program, or excuse me, I didn't get into any MFA programs. So this business of being in writing classes and having people to your face tell you what's wrong with your stuff, I find incredibly stressful. Does that ever go away?
I don't know. I think for some writers it does go away. I found it. I went through an MFA program, and I then went to Clarion, which is a writing program for science fiction and fantasy writers. And I think about the time, the second week of Clarion, just this week program, I realized I had this feeling of enormous liberation, which is that the feedback that I got in both programs was pretty much the same, and it was varied feedback. Some people were saying, I like this. Some people are saying, I don't like this. And I sort of thought, this is great. You know, I can do whatever I want, and I can listen to the stuff that I find useful, and I can just sort of discard the stuff that I don't. And what I really loved about it was getting to read and talk about other people's work. That when you get, it's an enormous privilege to get to see the work of your peers before it's actually published. And often when they're still in the process of figuring out what a book or a story is about, it's a really fantastic, useful thing. And I love that part. And in terms of getting critique, people have told me really useful things, and people have told me really stupid things, and I've told people really stupid things as well. But that's fine. That's just part of it.
It's impossible for me to imagine one of your stories in draft form. They seem so sort of seeing the end product only. One has a fantasy about them that they were written in one go. The intention and the effect is so completely unified. The idea of you sort of working towards it and trying different things, it's inconceivable. I feel the same way about Kat Valente. To see a rough draft of hers, I just assumed she was sort of this invincible super being who, secretes these perfected novels, 4 times a year.
Seems to be.
Whereas there's something like actually neurologically wrong with me that causes me to write these incredibly shitty first drafts and then painfully revise them. But I feel like I'm the only one who does that.
Well, I don't know if this is the same for Kat. She's an amazing writer, but I spent a lot of time feeling sort of excruciating pain as I sit in front of my keyboard because I think, this is stupid. This is a terrible sentence. Like, I can't put this in. It's horrible. And I think maybe that pre-writing period, which can last up to a year, in which I don't really manage to do anything. Maybe I'm actually, doing some work in the back of my head or something. Because I find it so horrible to begin to put words on paper that I, don't for as long as I can until there's something I absolutely have to do. And then I write as fast as I can in order to get it over with. And usually about usually 9 or 10 hours into it, I think, oh, this is much better than I thought it would be.
Right.
Not that the prose is better, but the act of writing itself is better.
What do you do when you're supposed to be writing? Do you surf the internet?
I do surf the internet. I read a lot. I really like to read pretty much everything. I like bad books. I like reading bad books. I find it, exhilarating to read really, really terrible prose. Just because I feel like, again, if you read bad prose, you're learning something about the effects that words have on you or don't have. Maybe it's like doing an autopsy or something.
On a hideously diseased.
You think I've never seen a sentence like that? thing is, I think if you work, maybe as an agent or anything where you read slash, is you love the really, really good stuff and you love the really, really terrible stuff. And it's the stuff in the middle where you just sort of think,
Yeah, no, I know. What reason does this have today? I wanted to ask you about something that you once said in an interview, which was that you can't be scared by something that you understand completely.
It's probably not true.
No, I think it is true. Though. I mean, I'm especially writing. I'm not even sure you self-identify as a fantasy writer, and I feel that I'm constantly wondering, the trend in sort of writing about magic and sort of magical systems, generally speaking, is sort of towards highly orderly, sort of systematized magic. I have a magic system. Lev Grossman has a magic system. Lots of people, have these sort of carefully ordered magic, and I always tend towards the showing. My magic, it's not that mysterious. It's not sort of, Gandalf waves his staff and then something happens 10,000 miles away. It's, I do the thing if he moves his hands around and then you hear a fizzing noise and then you saw a vital light. I feel I have this compulsion to show it all, and I always wonder, where do you draw the line? Because, it's true there has to be some component that's below the line. I have a sort of inverted iceberg arrangement where 90% of it is sort of up here, and then there's a little bit below the water line. So there's a little something that's hidden. But yours seems to have, you seem to have sort of normal icebergs. I feel like this vast shadowy shapes moving beneath the surface.
I'm wearing my Lovecraft necklace. I think one of the things I loved about these two books is that it does that fantasy thing, which is there's the real world, and it turns out there's another world that is sort of coexisting there, which certain people get access to, and which you, the reader, get access to as well. And what I loved about the sequel is that you find out, and then there's this third sort of black market economy, there's this other kind of path going on, and so you get to see it all over again. You get to see a third, and even with the first book, I felt as if there were lots of things that I knew that there were lots of things that were not present in the book, but which mattered. It felt like there was a lot of weight there. I would say your pyramid is probably 30, maybe 70-30 or 60-40. But and then the sequel really sort of opened that up, expanded it, and I thought, well, there's that, and there's probably all this other stuff. It feels like a fully realized world in which I am seeing through a set of particular characters how things work.
Right. That's the design effect. I often think about it in terms of obviously I'm fairly overt about this. I enjoy being sort of in dialogue with other writers. The Narnia references are fairly overt. The Harry Potter references are overly overt. But once one begins to sort of poke at this edifice that Roland has built, you start to realize it makes metaphors now. You start to find these sort of blind spots, or the edifice is a blind spot. It doesn't make any sense. You start to just find these little bits that these little pockets that she didn't fill in, or things that can't possibly be as neat as she thinks they are. For example, the division between Muggles and Wizards. There must be a gray area. There must be a gray market.
Sure.
That stuff, you can't contain it that way. It must seep out, and there must be this sort of weird, very seedy, disreputable kind of zone between them. I often find myself trying to, looking for neat distinctions and sort of zooming in on the dividing line and seeing, what's actually there.
Well, and this is what I love about fantasy is, somebody has made up something, a world or something that somebody does, and then, other writers sort of look at that and think, wow, you did that. Okay, now that means I can sort of go further in, or I can sort of flip this. And so it feels like there's just constant dialogue going on, and I am sure that is also true in non-fantastic literature. Just I am deeply, deeply interested in how it works in fantasy. And then there's sort of trace elements. I think it's because, it's very easy to read mimetic fiction and think, well, this sort of reflects the world. And when you read fantasy, it does reflect the world, but it also reflects literature. It reflects. It's a small enough canon in some ways that you can see what it's pointing at.
I almost think that that fantasy is more sort of densely intertextual. There's more action going on along that line than possibly most genres. Partly just because fantasy fans tend to be extremely well read in fantasy canon. You can sort of trust that if you're going to throw out a Piers Anthony reference and an Anne McCaffrey reference, that everybody's going to get one of them, and probably most of them are going to get both. You're writing for an extremely scholarly audience that has studied the canon well.
I wonder if that will become, less true now that I think fantasy has a much wider readership in some ways than it used to. And I know that there's a constant conversation now in science fiction about is it possible to be well read in the same way that it was possible to be a fan and see everything that went on during the golden age, during the 60s, during the 70s, and now I think many people feel that there's not really a core genre anymore.
It's strange in that way. I mean, a huge shift in our lifetimes is taking place, as far as I can tell. And I feel like there's some really interesting reason why that happened, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And I think Harry Potter is probably more of a cause than an effect than a cause. People really wanted Harry, and they wanted Twilight, and they wanted Lord of the Rings movies, and those things became massive phenomena. But one wonders why. And it is, there's a kind of tiny sort of bitchy side of me that feels like a bit sad about it. Like, Christ, they'll let anybody read fantasy. Quite exclusive. What I usually think is, I really hope they go on and they find other books as well. I mean, it is great to sort of, when all the Harry Potter books were coming out, to everywhere you went to see people reading them, thinking, all of these people you see have a body of literature in common now. Like there is something now lodged inside their brain. Yeah.
And then you think, but there's all this other stuff too. And once you move a little bit further out, people don't have the body of literature in common anymore. And I want more people that I can talk about, other books that I loved.
Yeah.